welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, especially on Inauguration Day. Some of us were talking earlier before we got started. I didn't realize that I had uh, scheduled this session to overlap with the inauguration, so we really appreciate you all joining us. But today we're going to talk about what culturally competent data science training looks like. This is the second session in our series on conversations on diversity and data. And I know a lot of us have been on Zoom quite a bit, but a couple of reminders. If you could keep yourself on mute while the panelists and speakers are talking, that would be really great. We'll have some time for more open discussion at the end of the call. And also, if you're willing to share your video, it's really nice to see faces more than names and boxes. But if you're not comfortable with that, that is fine too. We also know that a lot of us are working from home, or as someone said recently, living at work. So if you have pets or kids at home that come in, that's fine. This is a family-friendly event. But if you do have distraction in the background, then go ahead, turn off your video as well. So I just want to give a little overview of the schedule. I've got a couple announcements, and I want to walk through using Poll Everywhere. This is the resource that we're going to use to collect questions for our panelists. So I want to make sure everyone can get onto that. Jason McLaughlin is going to give an overview of the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, which we call EFI. Diana Delbotton is going to give an overview of our EFI Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group, and then introduce the panelists, and then we'll help to moderate the transition between the panelists. And then Alyssa Wilson will be moderating the Q&A using those questions that people post in Poll Everywhere. And then after 60 minutes, we'll take a quick break for people that need to hop off. But then if anyone's available to stick around for another 30 minutes, we'd love to open it up for more of an informal discussion. And so we'll do that at the end. I also wanted to make an announcement about our upcoming panel, the third panel in this series, and it's going to be on February 19th at 1 p.m. And it's going to focus on how four-year data-driven institution and programs can support students transferring from community colleges. And so we'll have Carolyn Brinegar, who is currently the Natural Resource Assistant at the James F. Matthews Center, speaking. She had attended the Central Piedmont Community College before transferring to University of North Carolina, Charlotte to complete her bachelor's. And last November, she defended her master's. So she'll be speaking to us from a student's perspective. Courtney Kowalczyk is the director of the Environmental Institute at Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. And so she works with community college students. So we'll share her perspective. And Julie Maxson is an associate professor in the natural sciences at Metropolitan State University. And they have a large number of students that transfer from community colleges. So we'll have their three perspectives on the February 19th panel. Okay, so I wanted to have everyone, one thing, in the chat right now, I've got a link to our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion page, and that has information on how to register for the February 19th poll. Then you can get to, let's transition to Poll Everywhere. So if you open up a web browser, you can get to the Poll Everywhere poll by just typing in pollev.com/EFI2021. And if I can pull up, or if one of the panelists could, or not panelists, sorry. Yes, thanks, Jason. Put that in the chat. If you go there, that should now be open and active. And so just to get us started, we were wondering, what is your favorite tool for teaching or learning data science, if you have any? And so we've got a couple coming in. If anyone else has some ideas, or if you want to upvote a question, then you can do that as well. And I just want to see if we've make sure that people are able to get on to Poll Everywhere. So we've got Stack Exchange, Zoom, Swirl, R. These are all great things. And at the end of today's meeting, later this week or maybe early next week, I'll be pulling together all these resources and sharing them on our webpage as well. So it looks like people are able to get to Poll Everywhere. That's great. And I will activate, when our panelists start, I'll activate the next question where you can submit questions for any of the panelists as they're speaking, or upvote other questions as well. And so we'll do that as we move along. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Jason so he can talk about the Ecological Forecasting Initiative, and then we'll move on to Diana.
Hi, I'm looking for my slide. I think that you can see it now. Okay, so just a real quick introduction. I think many of you are familiar with the Forecasting Initiative, but if you aren't, what we're doing with environmental science and ecology and related disciplines about managing or understanding how changing environment affects society is both sort of a formal and technical thing, and simultaneously a really familiar thing. And so I'll start with the familiar version. Scientific insights from research or from experience or from monitoring or from management get out in the literature, and they get out in practice, and it gets tested. People make decisions about it, and then that sort of cycles through to more research. So that's the cycle that I've got over on the left hand of my screen. And that's really what we're about, but that's been going on for 400 years. We need to be able to do it better. We need to be able to keep the research focused on people's needs. And one way to do that is through the more formal and technical process of forecasting, which is exactly like a weather forecast. There's a bunch of decisions that get made based on the weather forecast. The forecast pulls in a bunch of measurements, a bunch of understanding of how climatology and meteorology works, and that's made with uncertainty. And then we change our decisions and based on that. So you can do that for wildfires. You can do that for wild rice. You can do that for any of the decisions or policies that are close to your heart. So the Forecasting Initiative, the webpage is down there at the bottom, ecoforecast.org, is committed to connecting with people, to making decision, to finding which decisions people want to make, to finding what questions people want answered, and to integrating merging data and insights from academic research into those decisions. Ways to get involved: check out the website. There's a newsletter that Jody puts out periodically that has updates on it. And on the website, you can find various working groups, and I've sort of broadly categorized them into two groups. And I'm highlighting this because we're always looking for new voices and new people. You don't have to be an experienced forecaster. You don't have to really even understand, the technical side of what of what some people are doing, because the point is that the best science comes from integration. And so there's some groups we're working on education tools. Alyssa and I have been working on both compiling existing tools and finding the gaps, and relevant to this conversation, finding places where people don't have access to the tools that they otherwise would want to be able to do this. There's a student association, mostly grad students, that works on particular problems and helps each other out. There's a diversity, equity, and inclusion group that Diana leads, and many of us are involved in that tries to anticipate or how the needs of a more diverse community and tries to engage and learn from a more diverse community. And then there's particular partners. Those could be agencies or tribal entities or all sorts of groups that might use a forecast. And then there's a group that's sort of specific, made sort of oriented towards social scientists about technically how you get the science into decision making. Then on the this isn't like a really black and white line. There's gray between them, but there's additional working groups on developing the sort of methods and tools. The computational needs for this are complicated. So just having that infrastructure, computer infrastructure to be able to do it, there's a group on that. And there's a group sort of on sort of basic theory for how to better improve our forecasts. So that's just a quick introduction to the group. And again, we're a really big grassroots group. We don't have an agenda other than making forecasting more available to people. So if you've got ideas or are curious, get in touch with Jody or me, or just check in on ecoforecast.org, and we can, we'd welcome your insights and participation.
Hi, so I'm Diana Dalbotton, and I'm the director of the Diversity Committee, and work closely with Jason and Jody to help develop new initiatives related to diversity for the group, but also with our Diversity Committee, many of which are here today. And I think a lot of what we've been doing is talking about what we should be doing, so some strategic planning. And we're trying to widen the circle as well of people who are talking about diversity and FE and how they work together. And so that's a big part of what we're doing. And that's part of the reason for this initiative, to bring people together to talk about data and diversity. And we're hoping by doing that, not only that we spread knowledge, but also within our own community, but also that we widen our community. And we're a small committee as yet. We would love to have any one of you who's interested in this to join our diversity committee and help us think about how we can make FE more diverse and how we can help reach out to a wider group of individuals and include them in our community and teach them what forecasting is and teach them some of the tools and techniques for doing it. So that's kind of where we're at. And I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have three who have joined us. Tracy Bibelnix, I hope I said that right. Did I say that right, Tracy? From the University of Minnesota Duluth. Carrie Diaz-Eaton, who's coming to us from Bates College, but also is representing an organization called CUBES, the CUBES Consortium. So we love it when another network comes to our network and we can network together. And then I'm especially happy to welcome Christian Trujillo. He's an undergraduate student at Humboldt State University, and he was in my research experience for undergrads this summer. But while he was doing that, he very much impressed us all by telling us about an organization that he has started called Ciencia para Todos. I hope I said that right. And he's going to tell us more about that this morning. And I'm not going to take any more time with the introductions. I'm sure you can all tell us more about yourselves, but I'd like to go straight to the talks. And Jody, I believe we're starting with Tracy, is that right? Okay, and I'm turning it over then.
Okay, thanks so much to everyone, and thanks for this opportunity to share with you. And I'm hoping to learn from everybody who's here as well. So we're talking about teaching cultural competence in data science, and I have to say that on the last panel, John Zobitz, who was my colleague when I was at Augsburg, he and I actually, I think, had a big aha moment when it comes to cultural competence in data science and just problem solving in general and research. And that's when we decided we would take a group of students from Augsburg to Nicaragua to work with a very rural coffee cooperative. And prior to leaving for Nicaragua, John is a climate science mathematician, and we were working with our students who came from mathematics, chemistry, computer science, biology, physics, to look at ways in which you model carbon footprints in coffee production. And it was I have to say, to sum it up shortly, everything we did prior to going to Nicaragua and meeting the folks in the coffee cooperative went out the window. We had no idea what we were actually there for until we got there. And part of that is because of this idea of cultural competence, this idea of the ability to negotiate cross-cultural differences and accomplish specific goals with awareness, attitude, knowledge, and skills. So when we went there, we were convinced we were going to solve and improve, solve a problem that we had created. We have framed the problem. The problem was we needed to minimize the carbon footprint. Okay, in the rural coffee cooperative, there is no electricity. There is no running water. All the coffee is planted, harvested by hand. It's taken out on donkeys and then put onto trucks. The processing plant where they dry the coffee beans, one is woman-owned, but everything is done by hand. And so John and I are looking at each other like, okay, all of this modeling and everything that we plan to do is sort of just out the window. Why we were there, what the coffee cooperative actually needed was actually help in understanding how to build their ecotourism, because they weren't able to get their coffee certified as fair trade for various reasons and governmental reasons. And so they were losing out on the market share and getting their coffee actually out of the processing plant and exported to different parts of the world. To me, that was just sort of shocking to understand that just because it's a cool problem, just because you have data, doesn't mean that you necessarily, one, have framed the problem correctly, and two, you've considered the impact and the consequences of what you're doing with your data and with your solutions. Now, as I've moved into teaching a capstone course where we're looking at different problems that are coming out of both for-profit and nonprofit and community agencies, I've very consciously tried to roll my experience and all of what I've learned from that experience and readings and workshops and everything afterwards into my courses. That just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And a lot of what I teach my students is not really directly cultural competence. I mention it, I talk about it, I define it, but where my students need educating is in bias, implicit and explicit bias. And there's a lot of work that's coming out right now, particularly in AI and machine learning. That's looking exactly at this question: is just because you have the data, just because you can do the analysis, what is it? What are the consequences of it? What is the transparency of the impact of the data, of the analysis, and what is the agency to respond to the consequences and the impact? And is there agency? Do your results, if they are biased, if you're using them in a way that marginalizes already marginalized populations, that disenfranchises new populations, is there agency to actually correct it? And who's doing the oversight? Who's doing that response to it? I'm going to put a couple resources that I have in the chat for folks. I'll hold it up. If you've never read it, there's a great book by Kathy O'Neill, which is called Weapons of Math Destruction. Kathy kind of coined this idea of the ethical matrix, and it shows up in a lot of ways that we've already seen, like facial recognition and other AI techniques or AI approaches where we're training our models on data that's implicitly biased, and implicitly marginalizes cultures and different peoples. And if you're training your models on data that's implicitly biased, your results are implicitly biased. So, oh, thanks, Jody. You can do that. There's another book that's come out that's mostly out of, it's from academicians, but it comes out of industry. And these are leading data scientists. I know a lot of people in this book. It's this 97 things about ethics everyone in data science should know. And they're 2-page snippets. Like I said, these are some of the leading data science across the country and different organizations and different businesses, as well as from academia. And it really gets you to think. I mean, and these are quick. You can share them with your students. You can get them to talk about what they're hearing in there. And it's surprising to see how much students will react to these 2-page snippets where they just kind of are staring at you like, I never thought about that. I haven't had a chance to think about, wow, what am I doing? So those are some things, and then there's a zillion other things out there, but those are 2, I think, really great resources to introduce your students to that, again, are specifically focused on bias, implicit and explicit bias, which we know is part of training to be culturally competent, whether you're talking about cultural competence in a public sector or in academia, in teaching, or in negotiating, or just wherever you're at. Cultural competence, in my opinion, doesn't exist unless you understand where those biases are coming from and what you're doing about those. So I will stop because I could go on and on. I can take them all the time, but I don't want to. So that's where I'm at. And I'll pass it off.
All right. Well, thank you, Tracy. You gave us so much to think about in just a few short minutes, and resources. Thank you so much. And I'm going to move on to Carrie, and we're going to save Christian for last, if that's okay. And go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to chat a little bit about this more. I'm going to share. I do have slides. I didn't intend to make slides at first, but I then was writing notes, and then it turned into a presentation. So I guess what I just want to start with is a little bit of framing before sort of talking specifically about the things that I'm working on, because maybe that helps understand the conversation. And then if there's anything of interest that you want to talk about, that's what the panel's for, right? So just a quick thank you. I know one thing that I'm not great at is crediting everyone who has influenced my thoughts, because I find myself always like listening to conversations, and that just changes the way I think the next day. And I don't exactly know who said what, but I just know the landscape is different for me. And so I just want to acknowledge the whole communities that I am involved with in conversations like this that influence my opinion and the things that I do moving forward. I also want to sort of start with a sense of place and acknowledge that at this time I'm at my house, and where I live is on the unceded Wabanaki lands, and to acknowledge that historical connection that the tribes have to this physical location. And if I were talking on my campus at Bates, I would be channeling or being reminded by my colleague, Dr. Burnett, that Bates does not have any kind of tribal lands recognition because it has actively contributed to poor relationships with the local tribal communities, particularly around water rights, but not exclusively that. And so it's important to acknowledge, but then like that has to be really meaningful and it has to really influence. I can't sit at Bates and say, oh, well, just the fact that we're on Wabanaki lands is enough. We have to acknowledge that we have been an active participant in this oppression, both the college and then all of us as individuals. I want to then like talk about the fact that we're not physically here. I am, but you are not. We're on physically right now in this cyberspace. We're doing this you know, Zoom as part of a regular event now, or any of the platforms that we use in terms of online collaborative technology. They have this potential to open up the conversation, and cyber infrastructure for data sharing has a potential to open up the conversation, but that's actually more complicated than we make it out to be. Open for whom has to be a really important question that centers, I think, what we do and how we talk about it. So in this time when we're thinking about the election and the inauguration and all of the events surrounding, we're reminded that our online platforms are a mix of, they seem like public spaces, but they're actually private spaces. And they are paradoxically can be a place of oppression as well as a place of the networked counterpublic, which works to fight beyond that oppression. And I think that duality of our digital spaces is really interesting. And I think it's come up in all sorts of ways in the news, particularly lately, to be thinking about the role of data and the digital in the future we're shaping. The other thing that's informing my thoughts that I share today are sort of the multiple identities I hold as an academic and in terms of personal identity, many of which are from personal identities are marginalized in STEM. So for example, being Latina, being a mother, those are some places where I have actively felt I don't want to use it, felt underrepresented. I think maybe more accurately felt isolated and even marginalized actively in these spaces. But I think there is a lot of strength that comes from the multiple identities I hold. And in particular, a lot of those entities are sort of a foot in each world. Having a parent that is Catholic and a parent that is Protestant, a parent that is from Peru, a parent that is from a sort of colonial New England family. I think a lot of that means that I've focused on creating cultural competency between the worlds within which I already exist. And to do that by boundary spanning. And it turns out that actually is quite useful in the academic realm as well, and particularly for data science and other interdisciplinary fields. And so I have found myself as, even though my PhD is solidly in mathematics, it was very much a joint program. And so my area of specialty is in evolutionary theory and mathematical ecology. But after getting my PhD, I was never in a math department again. So I've been at these small liberal arts institutions and have been the mathematician for a biology department. I have been now, I'm in a computer science department. And so I continue sort of this cultural competency between disciplines even sort of throughout. And I've really focused, even though I sort of have that grounding in evolutionary ecology, and I think a lot about thinking about the systems in which we live as these socio-ecological systems, and thinking about them as communities that evolve together, and the overall sustainability and all of those questions. I've focused a lot of that grounding into what it means for interdisciplinary STEM education in particular. So, you know, how do we maintain these vibrant, diverse communities in STEM education? What does it mean to for disciplines to co-evolve together, et cetera? And I think like this, as I've moved more into specifically equity and inclusion work, I think that grounding in evolutionary ecology is, and I can say that as an ecologist or as an applied mathematician, this deep understanding about systems thinking serves us all well to do this work of equity and inclusion, because we really have to understand, just as was set up, we really have to understand the system and the biases and the reinforcement of this system in feedback loops. All of these kinds of things that we think about as ecologists and as modelers, they are intrinsic to also the way that structural racism operates in our society, and the kinds of things we have to think about like that. It's a wicked problem, right? That's a technical term for the, for folks in other audiences. And so my goal, because we know systems problems and wicked problems are really, really hard to attack, my goal for myself, but also one that I work with students on, is a lot of sort of taking the temperature and reflecting, a lot of humility, a lot of growth, you know, focusing myself on, you know, I have to have a growth mindset about the things I don't know about equity and inclusion and about cultural competency. But also let's reflect on this continuously. And so even when I'm working with students, I really focus on reflection. I think getting them to think deeply about who they are and the knowledge systems that they're involved with, and how this relates to the broader world around them. And one of the most influential conversations that I was a part of related to data science education in particular was an NSF Includes conference that I co-organized with NEON. And this was back in April of 2019. And out of that conference, I synthesized sort of a list of major topics that we talked about. And the result was sort of this broad statement: data science education for biology should acknowledge data as power, but not the only way of knowing, include ethics and social justice throughout, embody inclusive design, including evidence-based teaching pedagogies, and a rehumanizing curriculum. Rehumanizing is a framework that's common in mathematics, not common, one of the frameworks that's used in mathematics. Focus on access and equity, close the data divide. Remember that data are not neutral, nor are the algorithms based on that data. So bringing up Kathy's book as an example, or Algorithms of Oppression, or Race After Technology, these are all books that get at that particular thing. And then also maybe more, this goes back again to the open for whom question, respect data ownership rights and sovereignty. That was a sort of amazing group of folks. And as I was there, I was trying to think about, like, what am I creating in terms of curriculum for my students? How is that relating? How am I really doing justice? So I came to Bates just a little over 2 years ago. Time has passed differently lately, but just a little over 2 years ago, actually. And when I was recruited to Bates, I saw this. Bates was starting a new computer science program, not one that had been around in the 60s, one that was being started in today's context, and I think calls for a real opportunity to rethink how computer science education is done. And they were all pretty broad in terms of what computer science education was. So it was including also explicitly data science education. And as I was talking to folks in other disciplines about what kind of computing would serve the liberal arts college environment at Bates, we zeroed in on some early data science skills, everything from graph visualization to really thinking about p-values deeply, to just number sense generally, et cetera. And it so happened that at the same time, I heard of Carl Bergstrom and Jevin West's curriculum called Calling Bullshit. And I had thought for a while in the back of my head that, wow, like they're talking about this data reasoning, like this critical thinking that we're asking everyone to do. What if that was the entry point into a data science education? What if introduction to data science education wasn't like a traditional CS course or a traditional statistics course, but was also a critical education course. What would that look like? And so I meshed sort of the curriculum, the open education curriculum of Calling Bullshit, with sort of an introduction to data science to get student agency around the numbers that they were seeing. So I think that plays really nicely off of the last talk and the scaffolding for the last talk. Really, how do you create student agency around this world of big data? And so just to step back for a second, how does that relate to social justice or cultural relevance or anything else? Well, I mean, if we're thinking about the current context, there is so much different in each of our lives, but there are some commonalities. And I think the sort of dialogue and the big data information coming at us every day is something we are all living in common, that sort of every student can relate to. Seeing an ad for something that's related to something they were browsing before, or seeing a parent share a meme with their child that might not look like truth, but maybe exaggeration. And so a lot of students can really grab on to this because it's all relevant to them, sort of no matter where they are, but in different ways. This involves, and this is something that I wasn't necessarily trained in, but have been actively working on, is having these open discussions about power and data. When I first taught the curriculum, I thought, oh, like the hardest thing is going to be teaching students programming skills in R. And actually, like, it was my own professional development on how to have conversations with students about power and race in an introductory STEM classroom. That became the big professional development moment for me as an educator. Sometimes that was really explicitly talking about why do we see this? It's money. Let's follow the money trail. It's all economics. But some of it was even around when I did a module on bias in algorithms, pulling on Joy Balamwani's work. She's a poet of code. Just sort of amazing work in understanding sort of the facial recognition algorithms that erase Black faces or misgender, in particular, women of color. And, you know, getting students to realize this is not a problem with the particular algorithm, that's a symptom of a broader systemic issue, and getting that level of conversation out. And then giving the students the opportunity to link that to their lives in the ways that are relevant to them, giving them that opportunity to consistently make connections to their broader environment, their broader world. And this is how I found out about how serious the COVID pandemic was. I was teaching this class. I had students who had family in China. They were telling me about it before it hit mainstream news, and they were talking about the misinformation associated with it as well. You know, so these are places that automatically became way more relevant than even I could have anticipated. I think one thing is to think about what each of our disciplines can do to contribute to that conversation. When I was, you know, working in sort of more basic math education or quantitative literacy, and then when I started doing work later in writing across the curriculum, the answer was always the same. It was provide a foundation and then do it throughout. And so if creating students with cultural competency, with ethical data science skills, with you know, an understanding about race and racism and bias and algorithms, if those are crucially important to you, those are not one-off things. They are providing a solid foundation and then reinforcing consistently throughout the curricular and co-curricular experiences. And so I just want to sort of get folks to think about it being a shared everyone's responsibility and every discipline's responsibility to think about doing that, and to think about where it fits into your programming as well. Thanks.
Wow, thanks, Carrie. That was a great and enlightening short discussion there, and we appreciate it a lot. And we're going to move right on to Christian. Hi, Christian. And I'm so proud of him. He did so good in my RU this summer working with NASA. And go ahead, Christian, go ahead.
So, hello everyone, espero que todos están bien hoy. I hope everyone's having a great day today. I'm here to kind of talk about some of my experience, not only with my organization, but with other organizations I've had with my own background, mostly being in a Latino population, and how important it is to have bilingual information out there, not only for students, but also for parents in the general population who maybe not only speak English as their primary language. And so the program that I'm the director of at this moment at Humboldt State University is called Ciencia para Todos. And for those who don't speak Spanish, it means science for all. And this is a program trying to teach bilingual education, the importance of bilingual education, and basically making sure that we're going out to communities who speak Spanish as a first language and showing, hey, you can be scientists. When you grow up, you can be in the position I'm in right now. You can be in college and doing this. Where a lot of places that isn't, and Western top classes being bilingual sometimes isn't something seen as very positive. But hopefully with this program, something that changes it. But let me talk a little bit of my background, how I even got to this place in the first place. So growing up, going out a lot with my stepmom, she's from El Salvador. And so she only speaks Spanish. So I was kind of her translator my whole life. So whenever I'd go out anywhere, whenever I'd go to maybe a doctor's appointment, or even if people wanted to give us surveys all on the street, I would always have to be the person doing the talking or doing the translating with my stepmom and with the person who is doing the information. And I thought of this a lot growing up, and I was like, it would be really great if they had someone who was able to translate, who was be able to have kind of the conversations instead of a child or adolescent having to do it with their parent. And I think this is super important when thinking about collecting data. You think about who's on your team, who's creating your data. Those are two very important things, because when you actually go out to the real world and you're working with different populations, if you're not having those people in the background who know all this information when you go out there, you're not able to assess a whole population that is out there. And I know working with different organizations, that has been like a problem I've seen, where I work with an organization and I'm like, oh, we're in the Bay Area. So I'm from San Francisco in the Mission District. Huge Latino population, huge Spanish speaking population, and work with certain sites, education, curriculum, whether it is with the National Park Service or with the National Center of Science Education in Oakland, California. And like, they didn't have any Spanish resources out for families or students. And it was like, wow, it was really eye-opening to see that. And even at Humboldt State University, I remember once there was a professor who wanted me to help translate this trail survey. So for anyone who goes on this trail, they didn't have any other languages except for English. And so I helped translate this survey. And there was a problem in the survey that was really targeting certain populations. And I was like, hi, Andrea. Sorry, that's my little sister. Was targeting certain populations. And I was like, this is a problem. Let's look at this problem in this way. Let's have a conversation about it. And maybe let's think about not putting this on the survey because of these issues. And they didn't have anyone else at the time to really tell them that. And I think that was my first kind of example showing how you need people in the background who are creating this information or looking at this data to really understand the populations you're going to hit. Because if you don't, there's going to be a huge miscommunication with whoever's taking this survey or whoever's trying to, whatever information you're trying to get from a certain population. And so this isn't only just for Spanish speakers, like this is for any language at all, for any bilingual speakers. There's so many different bilingual speakers all over the US. And so making sure that you're having good people in the background and in the forefront speaking those languages that you're trying to get in certain populations. I remember, I think it was, oh, where'd you go? Tracy was talking about, oh yeah, Tracy, I'm Nicaraguan, so I'm from, my family's from Nicaragua as well. So when you were like bringing up going out there as well, I remember I actually got to go with the medical brigade to Panama, and there was a huge divide as well with the students that went. and like this and what we're trying to do there. And there's only like 3 other like native Spanish speakers with us, and I was one of them. And we were trying to teach about obesity and diabetes. And we were there as college students trying to teach people who don't go to school all the time or couldn't go to school all the time, maybe didn't know how to read. And it was like, okay, we set it up in a way where it was like for college students. And a lot of these a lot of the students that went there didn't know how to teach like teach in that way, and also didn't speak the language. So I kind of threw away the whole curriculum we had once we got there. And I was there the first day, and I was like, okay, we need to recreate this whole thing, and made like this game where it was a loteria game, which is basically Latino bingo, but has a lot of cultural like significance to it. And we taught about diabetes and obesity using that game. And it worked really well, especially since I was able to help like translate the whole thing. But it shows the importance of having those people in the background, I think. And there's so many more examples that I have working with different populations. The most recent one is I've been working with COVID relief here in San Francisco with the Department of Public Health, and in the Mission District, especially because a lot of marginalized or underrepresented groups have been hit by COVID so much harder than any other groups. And so kind of been there helping the translator, getting information from families, then they take their COVID test and then they go. And one of the new applications was they had a QR code, and you have to have a phone to open this survey to go and then get your COVID test. But then some people didn't have phones, especially the older populations. So that was a big problem. And then the other thing was the survey was all in English. And I was like, what? Our paper ones always had Spanish and English, which is great. But then the online form, it only had English. So I had to like sit there in line with each and every person and like fill it out with them because they had no idea what it was saying. And, like it held up the line even more. I was like, oh, we could be testing so many more people if this wasn't a thing. And if I wasn't there, there's 2 other workers online. One of the other ones knew Spanish and the other one didn't. So it was like, okay, how do we do this? How do we make sure we're pulling people out of line, putting people in line? So I think all of those experiences and that I've had really show the importance of trying to make sure to have people in the background. Because also maybe if they saw that, some people would try to like leave and be like, oh, well, maybe I don't know how to do this, so I'm just gonna leave the line. I was like, no, come back here. Like I can help you out. And so that's people, that's individuals, and that also messes with probably the data that like the Department of Public Health is going to be having to look at as well. And it's like you're losing people because of not having other resources, other ways of talking to people. So I think from all of those experiences and me working with this program, Untitled Chapter, I'm going to put some info here if any of you are interested in looking at it. We have an Instagram, we have a website, and have any questions for me, I'm totally open to talking about some of the other work that I've been doing. Those are a little bit of examples of work that I have done and how it could be important to cultural significant data. And yeah, I believe that's everything I have to say for the moment. And thank you for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you, Christian.
Go ahead, Diana.
I'm just going to say thanks to all of our speakers and how amazed I am of the turn the conversation took this morning, because it wasn't what I was expecting. So I think that's wonderful, and I've learned a lot. So I'm turning it over to you now, Alyssa, and let's go forward.
Awesome. Thanks to all 3 of the panelists. I'm going to jump into questions. You guys are still welcome to add more, and I'll try and look at those as well. It looks like our most upvoted question is directed to Tracy, but Christian, you may have some thoughts on this as well. This asks, do you or how do you facilitate partnerships with your students or in the classroom and then between stakeholders, for example, in the community in Nicaragua that you worked with?
Yeah, so this actually is related to another one of the questions that's on there. It says, as academics are often bound by discipline, how does the training benefit or suffer from the disciplinary infrastructure we had at our universities? and it makes it incredibly difficult, right? So as academicians, we're sort of reviewed in these narrow silos in terms of what we do and how it impacts and what we're judged on. So finding these partnerships requires that you go out of your comfort zone, get out of your box. I spent a lot of time, I kind of have my foot both in the business sector as well as in academia. So I have a little bit of advantage in terms of networking, but it's networking. It's about connecting with people and using those people as connections to other people. So most recently in all the work that I've been doing, I've been working with departments of public health. I've been working with nonprofit community agencies. I've been working with the local health foundations. And what I found is that this naturally brings me across disciplines. So if I'm working on a new model for measuring food insecurity, if I'm not talking to my partners in urban development or in sociology, or I'm not talking to the leaders in the communities about the sort of the everything that we've been talking about here, all of the presenters have talked about, I'm missing out. So facilitating those partnerships between the students means I've had to do the work up front to find those partnerships, to find those networks and the connections. We have a lot of great resources. You know, John and I were really lucky, and I wish I was at Augsburg every day I'm at UMD. But we have an amazing staff that's out in the world putting together these experiential learning opportunities for students. And so finding those agencies, even if they're at a different institution, that are connected to communities or connected to areas in which you want to work, it's about the networking. It's about just asking the questions and reaching out. In terms of facilitating student partnerships between students, I think there's where my role comes in as a teacher, to help students understand what is this thing you call networking? How do I communicate? How do I ask questions? How do I be respectful and culturally competent in working with our Native American communities here up in the Northland, and the folks that live on the tribal lands? How do I approach certain sensitive issues or maybe culturally relevant data science I could do without pushing them away? So how do I bring them in? And, you know, for me, we have some strong folks connected to the University of Minnesota Duluth that I can pull on. But it's work. It's hard work. It's not recognized work. It's not recognized. My department of mathematics. It's like, well, that's not math. What are you doing? Why are you working with the Department of Public Health? You know, why aren't you just publishing papers in math research journals? It's because, you know, and my answer is because that's not what I do as a data scientist, and it's not what's impactful. My work is social justice and having impact on students' lives as well as our communities. So facilitating those partnerships, it's not easy. You just have to get outside of the box and be creative and find people who are outside your discipline that are interested in similar types of things. Hopefully that answered the question, probably more than what people wanted to know.
Yeah, I could definitely talk about working with students, because I've worked with students. The whole organization is made out of students entirely. It's definitely getting yourself out there, like Tracy was saying, and trying different things out and seeing what really works. And a big thing is community work. Like, if that's what we really do, is we work with a big group of us, and we're like, okay, and then with all those different people, there's so many different ideas, but also more people to spread the knowledge and make other kind of partnerships with each other as well. So I think that's been the biggest thing.
And interdisciplinary teams. You know, when we're teaching these courses, Carrie talked about, you know, where do you find the place for this in the curriculum? And it really has to be infused across the curriculum, and not just in computer science, not just in math and stats, but it has to reach into engineering or sociology or urban planning. I mean, it has to reach across the campus. And the most exciting work that I've been done is when I've brought students from a variety of disciplines together to work on the same problem. And they're coming from very different perspectives, very different skill sets, but that collective lens and different perspective has really been impactful on the students. just to facilitate that interdisciplinary partnership across student communities and getting to know who their peers are that don't sit in their math class every day.
I'm just gonna, I just want to add one little thing, which is because I teach community engaged learning classes, which are a tagging mechanism mostly for classes that have this like sustained engagement with a community partner. And what I think has worked really well is to involve the community partner when developing the course.
Absolutely.
And also to connect them with students early. It's not just, it's more meaningful that way than just dropping students into a community engaged experience. And then it helps for a more relevant win-win and more efficient time period. So yeah. I did this when I taught a course in the fall that was community engaged learning. I was meeting with that partner all summer and asking about what they wanted out of the experience. And then they knew that they, you know, the time that they invested also on their side would be worth it. And then had very clear scaffolding for students. And the very, very first assignment was talk to your partner about what they want and who they are and what their mission is. Like that basic level of conversation. And then we all shared, and all of them shared back. So that conversation was like a grounding for the work that followed. And so it's hard to develop a relationship with a partner over the course of, in my case, 7 weeks, because we're on these abbreviated semesters with 2020, but having that kind of scaffolding to really understand your partner also helps.
I completely agree, Carrie. You know, some of the worst projects that come out of the University of Minnesota Duluth are those where we're going to do a community engagement experience, right? And it just, you know, it says, pick something that you think needs to be addressed, a problem within the city of Duluth or the close outer regions, and go and fix it, right? And there's no development of whether or not they should be doing this. Developing those relationships with those community partners and introducing the students early and introducing the students to why it's important that you're doing this. So it's not just, oh, I'm knocking on your door to do this thing for you, which I know will be helpful. And then when I'm done with this project, I'm done with the class, so goodbye, right? It's developing and nurturing these relationships and building students' capacity to understand why those relationships are important. That's the only way you make this successful. And I mean, it's hard work. It's hard work, but it actually then results in impact to communities where they can create action out of the projects that the students have done, and it builds something. Absolutely.
Thanks so much for those answers from all three of you guys. I wanted to just jump in quickly and say that unfortunately it is the end of the hour. So for those people who don't want to stay for the more informal part of this panel, you're more than welcome to log off. But for anyone who is interested in staying, we can still, I'm happy to keep reading questions, or if people just want to talk more informally, I'm happy to mute myself and just let you guys take over.
I think there's a lot of good questions still. So if we could work through a couple more of them, I think that'd be great. Are you good doing that, Alyssa?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I agree. Some of the questions are awesome in here. I thought one of the more upvoted ones that I think all three of our panelists could have great perspectives on is, how do you confront dissenting opinions on the importance of cultural competence in the classroom, or just on your campus in general, if you don't have a lot of experience in like classroom settings with that?
Well, I just tell them they're wrong. So there you go. If only that would work.
For me, I make sure that I work with the people who are going to uplift my work. And I've noticed that the people who don't want to work with us, don't see it as important, if they don't want to foster that connection, even though we've tried to reach out, it's not worth trying to foster. It takes more of the energy, more of our time, where we could be working with others who would really work with, who would like to work with us more. So that's my answer.
I might jump in just with some personal experience here. Of course, if you're teaching a class and there's different views in it, you don't have the option of saying goodbye. I've mostly faced this on a, not exactly the same issue, but I teach a lot about climate change. And I've had a few students in the class who have been sort of on the climate change denial side. And it's been really interesting having those students in the conversation because that perspective is out there. And in each case, there was a couple of times when I had very vocal students, but they weren't really disrespectful. They were, misinformed, as Tracy points out, but they were, and actually having a conversation in which you enabled them to put their view out there and to respond to it and have the class respond to it actually was a really effective way of sort of creating a sort of respectful environment where people could see that their arguments were pretty thin. And so, in fact, I even had one student at the end of the semester, he'd come to my office hours and battle me with like nonsense that he found on the internet, and we'd talk through it, and it was a lot of work for somebody who I could have blown off, but actually I think that it changed his view. And he said that in other classes he felt like he had been shut down. And I do feel that there is a sense, if you are there's a lot of grievance out there, and so people, if they feel that people are not respecting them, they get dug in even more. So I don't know, there's probably a balance.
I think, Jason, you're exactly right. And I've done some work with a job coach recently, and one of the things I learned from her, which some of my colleagues are brilliant at, is coming at those dissenting opinions from a place of curiosity, rather than coming at those opinions of dissent or this immediate negative reaction when we're talking about bias or implicit or explicit bias. If I'm defensive in what you said, if I attack you, we're not going to get anywhere. So coming at those dissenting opinions from this place of curiosity, asking questions. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you think? Did I hear you say? This is what I heard you say? Opens up the conversation, and at the end we can agree to disagree if that's where we're at. But at least the conversation gets going, and everybody has a place in the table. So it's difficult. We're having these discussions on the campus of UMD around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and whether or not to do things like cohort hires. And there are some amazing dissenting opinions who are pulling out, dare I say, bullshit research on how cohort, yes, exactly. Calling bullshit. But the only way you can engage with these folks, because the more you push back, the harder they push back, and there's no conversation.
Those views are out there, and if they get dug in and say, well, I can't say what I think because of political correctness or whatever, it gets hardened. On the other hand, you can't have somebody who's a dissenter constantly undermining you.
No. At some point, they get cut off, right?
I think what you said is,
it also depends on what level of power they're at in the whole dynamic structure of the conversation.
Right. But I like what you said. If you invite them to make their case, a lot of times they kind of know they're on thin ice, but if they have to make the case that diversity is not important, it's going to sound absurd, and you can let them hang themselves with their own argument that way often. or they're not going to convince many people anyway.
I think that is a really great segue to another question that was posed, which is that if scientists appear ignorant because they can't see their own biases, or maybe they're citing literature that is unfounded in some way, does that drive an anti-science bias in some cultures? Thinking about different cultures in the United States, but also maybe socioeconomic classes and things like that, if you have experience. Carrie, I see you're ready to jump in here.
Well, if when Jason shared the cover of the Calling Bullshit book, I thought this is a really good text that explores some of these issues. Not as much from a cultural competence side. I mean, to be fair, the authors of that book are both white men, and so I have had to supplement other materials from a more diverse range of viewpoints. But there are a lot of issues with science. If we sort of commit to saying that data is a model and all models are influenced by our own, our own perceptions of what's important to ask for questions and our own humanity, then all of science is biased, right? That's like really forward and like disturbing for people. And then it plays into a narrative that science is somehow then partisan, even in those biases. And so like, one of the tactics that they use in Calling Bull is, yes, to like pull apart like all of these places where science can go wrong and who drives that and why does it happen? But then they come back to, but we know science works because we know that like smallpox is not a prevalent disease in the US anymore. So vaccination for it worked. Like those kinds of touchstones to come back to, help somewhat, right? Like when the March for Science happened, right, and all of the sort of discussion around science funding, the rhetorical strategy then was to come back to, but healthcare. So like they might want to, there might be a general want to defund climate science for whatever reason, right? Like, I sort of riffing off Jason's conversations, but then when they understand that science also helps cure cancer, right? Like it's like, okay, that's a rhetorical strategy of use. So I think one of the other kinds of broader strategies, and we talked about this actually in a campus conversation related to our own communications rhetorical strategy. So what is a rhetorical strategy for science? One of the things that our students sort of suggested and said, or our community members, was to be authentic. Don't try to hide the faults, be open with them, but understand that it still works and what you're working towards, and like being more authentic. It's a body of thoughts that are sort of coherent, but I'll let someone else take it.
I'll just mention one quick thing, which is in front of me right now. I'm and Alyssa is joining me in this effort, are teaching the intro stats course in biology next semester, and I'm Bayesian. And Bayesian philosophy recognizes the role of subjective belief in science and the fact that the models are just a simplification. So there is some real, like the cutting edge of scientific inference these days acknowledges that science isn't some objective truth, that it is really just us confronting our own mental models with flawed data. So I think you can even make the case more easily now that these approaches have become more mainstream, that if your idea is, well, science is objective and so I can't possibly be biased, that would be that's not how a lot of science works these days.
Except that we're constantly being admonished by the media and social activists to believe that science is real. science is real, follow the science. Science is real, follow the science. And I really think that that's turning a lot of people off because they're seeing how flawed the science is very much because of COVID. And that it's not some, it's creating a misunderstanding of what science is to say science is real, follow the science. And especially when it gets it wrong for so many cultures besides the white culture. And we know that it does. So then, you know, I think it's that combination of science and politics that's driving people crazy. But Christian, maybe you have something to say about that, because I was really intrigued by your experiences working with COVID. So
before Christian, you do that, I unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave. This is an amazing discussion. I would love to continue. I look forward to the summary of everything, but thank you so much for having me on. This has been an education for me, and thank you for this organization. So have a great day, folks.
thanks,
Take care.
Tracy.
So, well, rephrase the question again. I had an answer coming.
So what are you feeling in all of this discussion? I was intrigued by your discussion of the lines and people leaving the lines in a way because of the lack of cultural competence on the part of the scientists who put together the tables, right? And the lines.
I definitely think, I know it could be done better. I know it can be done better because I know that if I'm really interested in working with DPH probably in the future, and so I know that if I was there like on the team, I would be like, I know this is a problem. I saw it happen. Let's make sure that this doesn't happen next time, and have someone who can speak here, make someone who can speak here, making sure that everywhere there is someone, a point of where you can go to. Because if you don't have that, then we'll have more people leave, and that's going to change things up. I think that would be in my head. I would bring it up like a whole bunch until it happens. Yeah.
Right, and then the other thing, I think it might have, a couple people brought it up, but that science isn't the only way that you know things, and that other ways of knowing things have proven better than science as often as not. And so that's no disrespect to science. I am a scientist who admires science and thinks it's been useful, but if you have this idea that that science always beats other arguments, you can look back at a history of science making terrible mistakes that continues to today. So yeah.
Yeah, well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, Alyssa. I was just going to say, I think that stressing science as a way of knowing is a really good thing. And I think that the way that most people think about science is like, oh, I took that biology class one time and I just had to memorize a bunch of stuff. Even though we stress the scientific method over and over and over again, what they remember about classes is like, oh, I just had to memorize all that stuff in organic chemistry, or I had to memorize all of the bones in anatomy, or whatever it was. But really, when it clicked with me that science was a way of knowing things, and then contrast it with other ways of knowing things, that's what really helped me understand what some of the flaws were and how to talk about that with people who aren't necessarily scientists.
I was just going to add a thing that I think Anna already said well, but in particular, our introductory courses, rethinking why this is a liberal, oftentimes a general education requirement, a science course. And again, going back to like, what are we doing in those courses that is contributing to this, right? And I think Anna points out exactly some of the features that contribute to this. And also coming from a background in math, we have a whole bunch of issues there about, when we send a student through a math requirement, are they really getting out of that math requirement what they need that would serve them best as a participant in this world? And I think it's some of the same issues as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Diana's point about like the emphasis on trusting science for a moment. I think that there's a big problem right now in especially undergraduate science education where there is just like this trust in science as fact, but we never go back to like things that we thought were true in science and was like the like standard hypothesis of the day, and how we've revised that, or we now recognize that some things were wrong in the past. And that's like a major part of science, is revising what we know as truth, you know. So introducing students to that part of the scientific process in lower level courses, I think would really help to actually like get students more engaged, or like, you know, kind of believe in the process, maybe not all of science, but just the process of scientific understanding more.
My textbook that I'm using for intro stats, which I quite like, though it has flaws, has a whole section on Fisher, Galton, and Pearson, two of the great giants of the 1920 statistics, and talks about their great accomplishments as statisticians, and never mentions once that all three of them were spectacularly rabid eugenicists. And that's what they were using it for. It's like not even in the book. Eugenics isn't even in the index. And I'm like, that first of all tells you a lot about how we teach stats. And secondly, it's really a missed opportunity to talk about how science really works, which is what statistics is supposed to be about. So yeah, I think scientists are really thin-skinned about this overall, at least the writers of my textbook, who I otherwise like. You know, it's like they don't like when people say that they don't know everything. Yeah.
There was a related question that was talking about sort of the history of numbers and racism and oppression, et cetera. I put a link to a Twitter thread by someone who's a science historian. And I think, Jason, this addresses also what you just talked about, because there was this sort of infamous Twitter debate on 2 + 2 = 4. And I know this sounds silly, but this is a reflection of our own real things that we're grappling with as a community. It sounds on the surface so simple and easy, like what's the problem? And yet, if we dive deeply into the history of that phrase, we uncover exactly what you're talking about, Jason. You can sort of read the whole thread at the time, but there's this sort of use of counting in a particular way in order to remain dominant, and this is sort of a philosophy that Galton is involved in actively. And what I find really interesting, I admit I don't do as much of this historical perspective, but in my own classes, but our department right now has 3 appointed positions into our program, and the PhDs of the 3 appointees are myself in math, my colleague in visitor in computer science, and then a colleague in history. And so the historian, who is who studies, she puts all of this into this beautiful context of history and what history can tell us about the history of computing, the history of numbers, these kinds of conversations. And I find it very refreshing and wish I had had courses that contextualize things in the same way. The small pieces that I have done in terms of this, the Calling Bull curriculum, for example, and I'm going to kind of go back to that as a touchstone, but we talk about null models, right? And negative results, and like trying to understand, what is it we're comparing? Like, is it good to have a p-value greater or less? That, like, what does that mean? Like, good, bad? Like, what does that even mean, right? And I think even just talking about negative results, and then sometimes I share my own sort of realizations that like, actually, when I was working on my dissertation and I get a quote unquote negative result, and then I realized actually that was more interesting than if my hypothesis had been confirmed, right? And so I think that also speaks to the to that in terms of, yeah. And the other thing too is I teach this other course that's a writing intensive course, and it's I don't know, I guess my version of like an ethics for computing class, but we do go over sort of history. It's called the past, present, and possible dystopian future of computing. And we do this in a film-based way because I find like to get students to watch a movie on their own and think thoughtfully is a lot easier for everyone to do as homework than it is to like get them to read many manuscripts and sort of think about it thoughtfully and together. There's just more interesting conversations you can have in a more compressed time for me. But we do include things like hidden figures and like imitation game, and talk about inclusion and exclusion into STEM conversations and the ability to make contributions and what if, you know, and the sort of ways that there have been barriers. It's really interesting to have certain students in those courses that honestly can't understand what it's like to be excluded from science. That is just like a thing that they have never thought about. And all when I ask them to write about their relationship to science, it's always very, very positive. Like, it's like you have to really like coach them to think about like, to understand that that writing in reflection, like that is a reflection of their own privilege. It was interesting, let's just put it that way, versus sort of everyone in marginalized groups immediately talked about that feeling of isolation or exclusion. Related a little bit, I just kind of want to touch back to something Christian said, because I've also been working, because that's a writing intensive course, working on multiple forms of writing as being something that I help them do. It's not just about the scientific report that this is going to create, but rather that they can talk about issues facing digital worlds and cultures and computing with creative writing and poetry and blogs and all the way up to, you know, formal scientific writing. But also I offer them the opportunity to write in another language, even language mesh should they choose to do so, which I think is also an important part of validating sort of their own background and culture and history. And we watch movies in other languages too that do that effectively.
So one thought I had just briefly is, if we perceive the world as a world of good and evil, which is a non-scientific way of looking at the universe, where does science fit into that? You know, and there's a lot of science that's evil, and some of it is good. And how do you get yourself on the side of science that's good? But, you know, when we invent things like the A-bomb without thinking about what might happen to the world, or thinking about it and not caring, where are we, you know? So.
Yeah, it's interesting how much of science has implications that the scientists didn't think about or didn't anticipate. And from a scientific perspective, it might be really cool and really interesting, but ethically, it's a little more complicated, let's say.
But would that be because science doesn't recognize things, concepts like good and evil? They are not scientific concepts.
Right.
Yeah, it's my experience. I've been involved in some good science and some evil science, so I can speak from experience. It's very interesting how ethics gets marginalized in scientific work. You know, you start off always having a conversation about it, but then it easily like the ethical aspect of it shrinks very fast, and you start thinking about the technical aspect of it, and you start thinking about you know, the advances you can make in your field and the generality of how important it is. And actually, I think one of the things that's actually coming around, at least in in the kind of ecology that I do, even from the funding agencies, is they're getting a little tired of people framing things in the context of sort of soft, incomplete and vague language about how this will help for climate change, or this is a big issue. You know, if someone gives a talk now and they say their work is going to help human health or climate change, I want to know specifically, or if they want to help a specific community. I'm like, okay, yeah, you say that, but how does it really work? And I think that enables all this stuff that all three speakers talked about in terms of actually engaging community, because it makes it much more concrete. I can say, oh, I'm going to develop this AI algorithm to recognize faces that will help the economy. And it's like, okay, specifically, who are you helping? And you can see that it's not as representative. Whereas if you were working, you know, with a concrete, you know, a group that has a well-defined problem that needs science to help, that has helped work jointly with the scientists to develop the proposal and to develop it, it seems much more concrete, and the ethics are embedded in that relationship. So I do think that you know, I just had Alyssa and I were just at a meeting for a NSF program called Macrosystems, and it was really interesting how emphatic the funders were about making the ethical consequences and the human impact of the science very concrete. So I thought that was a useful a nice change of pace, and something where the ideas that you guys have suggested will be very useful for us.
If you're doing science in an undiverse way, like it's only the dominant group doing the science and the other, and then you're not even working on your biases, then you, by and large, doing evil science in some ways, you know. And I think that's where our diversity committee is kind of thinking, you know, is how to make that not be the case, you know. But if you like talking about this kind of stuff, you should join our diversity committee. I have to give a plug for that, because we have these fun discussions often, frequently. What, once a month? I think it's not a huge commitment. Once a month for an hour, come and join us and help us perpetrate our discussions. Anything else? I'm happy to stay on and talk to people, but in 4 minutes, my computer is going to shut down automatically with no choice given to me. So if you're here when I come back, I'll see you.
That's a great kind of computer. I wish my computer would shut down with that. That's a great.
I don't see why it should do that, but it's evil.
Good. Well, it was so nice to see you guys, and the great discussion. Really fun to. I got tons of ideas. So I hope we can keep in contact, and I've got a lot of reading to do and a lot of websites to check out, but looking forward to more conversations in the future.